Right, Paula, welcome to the Easy Conversations show. Thank you for joining me today. And we've had our share of technical difficulties, but I think we're going to figure this out today. So I appreciate you taking the time and appreciate your patience as well. But
Oh, my pleasure, Furkhan. It's great to be here.
thank you. Thank you. And before we jump into our conversation today, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what it is that you've been doing, which is a lot. So I'm really
Sure, I'm happy to. I am a professor at Northeastern University. My background is I'm an org psychologist, and most of my career has been dedicated to helping people who are living and working outside of their home culture or those who have to work in a multicultural setting. So anytime someone's in a situation of novelty, what I'm doing is really helping them work in that environment. More recently, Andy Palmer and we started a company called Skillify, which is a public benefit corporation dedicated to helping really everyone build the soft skills that they need. And he and I also just recently wrote a book called Live for Living. And that book is about stepping into another unknown, and that is a career journey and helping people find the career that's most fulfilling for them.
Oh, that's amazing. And I guess when you share you're an organizational psychologist, what does that entail? Because that's first thing that comes to me. What does that mean? And how is that different than some of the other psychology backgrounds or specializations people have?
Sure. So, industrial and organizational psychology is Division 14 of the American Psychological Association. So, it's an area of psychology, and it's really the field associated with people at work. So, whether it's the way talent is managed through an organization, or how people interact with their organization, or how people interact with their jobs, learn in their jobs, learn from their jobs, people who have to work in teams, leadership. There's a lot of different areas that we cover. Mine is specifically around that kind of multicultural lens, but also more specifically, people who move into situations of novelty, like anything that's new and different is a little bit out of one's comfort zone, like starting a new job or managing one's own career. That's really what I do as a psychologist. That's what I'm focused on.
Okay, great. So a lot of the times when I see people wanting to step out of their comfort zone or even step into a new situation, for example, that can induce a lot of anxiety. Is that something you also see, even if it's work related? I'm assuming people do have a little bit of resistance around change for various reasons, and often it can induce anxiety for people. But how do you manage that in the workplace then?
Yeah. So it's interesting. Everyone has their own kind of comfort with being out of their comfort zone. Everyone has a different tolerance of ambiguity. Some people can take wild risks and feel completely at ease, while other people just trying something new on a menu can cause some anxiety. So I think a really big kind of first step, regardless of what we're talking about, whether it's a career change, a location change, a relationship change, anything, it's about understanding what kind of brings you to that point of anxiety, and then understanding how much of it you can live with. So for some people, you can push beyond your comfort zone and settle into the ambiguity and then learn how to be in that. And for other people, they like retreat back and it's not good. So it's a bit of self-discovery for every person, and everyone's a little bit different. But what we find both in practice and research is that if you can move people up the sort of levels of ambiguity and their comfort with it, that's where they really expand and grow. Not too much and not too little. You want to get them in that stretch zone.
Yeah, what I've come to realize, this also relates to resilience. It's around finding that optimal challenge, right? If you're going to push yourself too much or challenge yourself too much, you may get discouraged. And if there's not enough, then you may not feel motivated. So that's what I'm hearing as well in this regard is it's a bit of a delicate dance, right?
Yeah. When we did some research around people who work multiculturally, and we were when individuals were placed in extreme situations like international volunteerism, think like Peace Corps kinds of opportunities, and they were absolutely ready for it, they flourished and their cultural agility competencies grew and grew. Other people that if they were low and we put them in those similar situations, they withdrew and they really ended up returning home or just not being effective or looking for comfort in people who were similar. And the same was true like for people who had lower tolerance with ambiguity, those who were able to step it up more gradually, like maybe doing some volunteerism locally first, they grew in those environments. So it was really trying to find the right balance
Yeah.
of who individuals were with the experiences that they were being.
And then in the multicultural aspect, how does that fit in? I could appreciate in organizations, there's a huge focus now, at least in the time I've been working too, there's focus on, okay, how do we get more diversity, not only through people, but in voices as well. So how does that factor in? And I'm wondering if there's overlap with that regard as well.
Yes. So we work a lot with diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders. For that reason, individuals who are culturally agile are able to work comfortably across demographic differences. And those differences could be generational, it could be professional differences, national differences, whatever. So it's all kind of coming down to the same skills needed. And it's really basic. They're things like tolerance of ambiguity that we just mentioned, humility, the ability to say, look at I can be really great in the professional or the technical aspect of what I do, but I don't know how to be effective in this context or with this group. So
Mhm.
really learning, being willing to learn about the context that you're in. Things like resilience that you mentioned, the ability, because you're going to make mistakes when you're with people who are of different cultural context. You're going to make mistakes, right? This is natural. To be able to bounce back from that. Relationship building, the ability to find similarity and form positive, trusting bonds.
Mhm.
Things like curiosity, being just really interested in others. So they're all a function of what makes people effective in that multicultural environment. So what we're doing with the DEI is saying, look at these are the skills we need to work on in order to help your employees be effective and have voice in a multicultural environment.
And there's this aspect of various cultures have their own practices, right? So, for example, some cultures, when you're talking to the other person, you make eye contact, in others, you don't. In an organizational setting, how do you find that right balance where people still feel like they're being respectful to others and not disrespecting their cultural backgrounds or whatever the norms might be? How do you factor that in an organizational setting? Because I could see that could be at least being a challenge from my perspective.
And be misconstrued. Like you said, making eye contact can be seen as aggressive in one culture, and it could be a sign of respect to look at someone in the eye. It could be a sign of respect to not look at someone in the eye. So that's a great example. My favorite one is smiling. I was socialized from childhood to smile. I mean, my parents would actively say, "What's wrong?" if I wasn't smiling. So my default expression is a smile.
Yeah.
What I realized, like in many places around the world, is we learned from cross cultural training is that a smile can mean warmth in one culture, and it can mean you're crazy in another. So we need to consider, and I'm just like having a little fun with this, but there's a lot of nuances in every culture, and every culture has variance as well. So it's not the same everywhere you go in culture. So what we focus on are two sides of the equation. The one side of the equation is the the learn before you go. That's the idea of understand what could potentially be different, how you might be perceived, what could be unique to that context that might be different from what you're accustomed to.
Mhm.
Just so that your brain is able to see what might be present in that new environment. So the kind of first part of the equation is specific and really knowledge. The second part of the equation is try to build the competencies needed to be effective anywhere.
Hmm.
And those are the things we just said, right? Resilience, perspective taking, humility, curiosity. Those are the type of competencies that you can drop anyone into any cultural situation and they'll thrive because they won't react quickly. They'll be patient. They'll be able to ask a lot of good questions and learn about the situations that they're in. So I always, whenever we're talking about people are concerned about doing the wrong thing, it's like learn before you go and then build those competencies.
Yeah, and I do want to come back to the competencies because they are transferable, as you mentioned, because aspect of humility, you can be open to other people's experiences or what they've been through or what their backgrounds are, recognizing that you don't know it all, right? And that's one of the things I try to practice even as a therapist, because there's this whole focus on having that cultural understanding and competency when you're working with clients as well. And you can't really know everyone's background. So how can you maintain that humility in terms of perhaps you don't understand, even if they share the same culture as me, I may not fully appreciate what they're going through because there's so many layers and there's so much nuance, as you mentioned too. So I can appreciate the humility, which kind of feeds into that curiosity as well, where you're able to ask open questions to understand. And that to me shows the other person's really interested and they're not judging me or whatever may be going on in the background. Just that curiosity can open up a nice discussion. Is that kind of the same response once people are able to practice those competencies?
Yeah, yeah, that it's interesting. Humility, for all the reasons you just named, so critical in a work context specifically. What we found was that of all the competencies I named, that one by far was almost the one that was the non-negotiable when we're asking people to go into environments that are multicultural or culturally diverse. You have to be able to be open and to be able to say, I don't know. I can't predict what you're thinking. Where you could, if you were in a monocultural setting, you can guess what someone's thinking with not a lot of accuracy, but maybe more accuracy than you would if you're in a situation where you really don't know the context.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting. That was one of the most critical
Yeah.
competencies. The other one that was interesting is that when we did the studies around humility, we found that there was felt humility and expressed humility, and those kind of had different functions. Like, so the felt humility, that's somebody saying, "Look, I feel like I am a humble person in this situation. I respect the culture. I respect the other. I respect the other opinion. I respect difference. I respect like the belief that you get it."
Right.
Expressed is how you're landing in the hearts and minds of those who are interacting with you.
Mm.
And they're both important, right? You have to believe that this is a value, but then you also have to behave in the way that's landing such that others are sensing and perceiving that you care to know uh, about what how to do things here or their opinions or whatever
Right.
the essence of the humility might be.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
That is interesting because I can see cognitive dissonance there, right? You may think you're being humble, but it's not coming across that way. So that's always interesting. And is that kind of the idea? Is like me feeling humble or express feeling like I want to be humble, but then it may not come across that way? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was exactly it. That was especially salient when we're talking about cross-national differences. So if we had somebody who was from a very direct communication culture and they were saying, "No, I absolutely value differences," but yet the hearts and minds of those that they were interacting with, maybe from an indirect culture, might be sensing almost like a lack of respect, having nothing to do with the individual and how they're really feeling, but having to do more with just a style of communication.
Yeah.
So there's layers to this, but it always goes back to the two sides of it. We have to work on understanding how you're perceived and what is and could be different in the context that you're in, while at the same time making sure you do have the skills in order to be effective in the environment.
For sure. Yeah. And there's obvious reasons for this, but I just want to understand if there has been research that you've either conducted or come across the value of multiculturalism in an organizational setting. Because again, there's a lot of talk about it and you've shared some of it already. But when you actually get to the root of it, what is it in what's in it for the organization to focus on it and even embrace it as a value for themselves?
Yeah, gosh, it a lot. So you're really talking about from bottom line, what's in it for the company? What's the wealth creation? What's the return on investment of investing in DEI? At the highest level, it's the right thing to do. You're an ethical organization. You want to have strong values. You want to have values that people feel proud of and want to be a part of. So that's at the highest level. If you want to get down to like very specific things, it, we know that when multicultural teams are highly effective at what they do, and it takes a lot to get a multicultural team highly effective at what they do, they can be more creative, they can be more innovative, they bring more ideas. A multicultural workforce tends to reflect a client base better than a monocultural
Mhm.
workforce would. Leaders with different styles and diverse styles can usually spread the organizational culture better than those who only have one style. There's the benefit of feeling psychologically safe in
Yep.
an environment to be able to express yourself in an environment. Just because you're demographically different doesn't mean your opinions devalued. So that psychological safety becomes important. So there's so many great reasons, um, just practical reasons to want to make sure voices are heard. I personally get a little worried. The answer to a lot of this has been unconscious bias training, and there was a place for it, but I really don't think that's been enough. I think they have to move from unconscious bias training over to cultural agility training to really get those benefits.
And what's the difference? Now, I've been through unconscious bias training and it's very pervasive, right? You don't know some of the biases. I've actually done some tests where I thought I was fairly aware of my biases, but they creep in the most subtle ways. I can definitely appreciate why it's important as an individual to sometimes be aware of some of these biases, but what is the benefit of focusing more on the cultural agility versus the unconscious biases?
Yeah, yeah. So Furkan, you're advanced. As you're a counselor, you're advanced in your ability of what to do with this information, right? So we are all, every one of us, everyone with a functioning brain has this thing we're calling unconscious bias, but it is nothing more than
Mhm.
stored data about situations and people that you're interacting with that your brain in split second in fraction of a second will judge, and any subjective judgment that comes out is a function of stored data. So that's it. It just all it means is for however long you've been on the earth, you have data that's stored, and this thing we're calling a bias comes out. And
Mhm.
like you were saying, again, you're far more advanced in this, but you're saying, hey, it was good to know. I could work on some things. The reality, though, for most people not as advanced, is that they're saying, okay, this test told me that I have a bias. So the next time you run into someone who is demographically different, what's the reaction naturally going to be? I don't want my bias flags flying here. So I'm going to just not engage in the conversation. So actually, what we're seeing is it's doing more harm than good when the next step isn't done, and that is helping people become culturally agile in the environment when they're with people who are demographically different. So I think by calling it bias, we've actually, I
Right.
don't know, I think it's done more harm. I really
Yeah.
do. And some of the data suggests that as well. So I'm concerned.
Yeah. No, and I could appreciate that. I think it could have an unintended consequence where the it's well intentioned, but then the consequence of it, as you said, perhaps the individual may not engage in fear of perhaps even disrespecting another person and stuff like that. So how,
Think about how quickly, sorry, excuse me,
that's
but
okay.
think about how quickly you can overcome. So basically, the quote unquote bias is coming from the limbic system, right? But we know we have these prefrontal cortex that actually is highly functioning in a second. So in a split second, you make a judgment about someone, right? Let's say someone who's demographically different. Yet you notice that they have the same wristwatch as you're wearing, and you point it out. All of a sudden, your brain flips into a completely different system that sees the person as someone of similarity. It's an evolutionary function. Now, all of a sudden, the person has a shared similarity, which opens up the kind of an opportunity for a natural conversation.
Yeah.
I would much rather focus on training the skills on how to become effective, to find similarity, to ask questions, than I do to just point out biases.
Yeah. And that's
Not brain operate.
And that's the whole aspect of what you're describing there is how one becomes agile then from a cultural perspective. Okay. There are a couple of things that you shared earlier I do want to circle back on. And these are things I've really spent a lot of time debating with others and thinking about myself, but I'd love to get your thoughts because one of the things I see with in the DEI space, the focus becomes on metrics and numbers. And I wonder, is there, and I don't know what the right answer is. Obviously, I think you may need a bit of both, but I wonder, do you get to this whole notion of inclusivity in an organic way, or do you have to focus on the numbers at times to feel like, okay, your organization or your team is well represented? So I'm not sure what the right answer there is, but my concern often with the numbers approach or metrics approach is you're not hiring the right person for the job. You're more focused on what they're bringing in terms of the visibility or the representative aspect of it.
There is something beneficial to having representation within whatever the entity might be across the organization, across a leadership team, across a university, whatever. Without that, if there is without that, you don't have the ground for which, this from which this cultural agility can be built
Sure.
among your employees or your students or whatever. So I do believe there's a place for kind of actively searching for opportunities to create diversity in whatever the group might be. That said, that's never enough. If you look at go into any cafeteria in any university or any workplace at any point in time, any bigger organization, people are clustered according to demography. And it's not because they're naturally racist or sexist or xenophobic. It's because people naturally gravitate toward comfort when they have an opportunity to relax, right? So if you're on your lunch or whatever, it's that what's beautiful to see. I love walking into organizations where you go into the cafeteria and that's not the case. Groups are together. They'll say, "Oh yeah, those are the engineers or those are the whatevers," but it's not it's not a demographic difference for which they're break. That's when I know a company gets it,
Mhm.
right? Where they've created an environment, culture that's really working. So what often will push against, say, for example, if I'm working for a university might, or consultant for a university, they might say, oh, we've got students from 100 different countries, but are they friends? Like how many universities talk about the number and the diversity of students, but not really understanding whether or not they've learned how to connect and build and trust and collaborate together. So there's and companies are identical.
Yeah.
Same exact thing has to happen.
Okay. And I appreciate that. That's a very interesting and unique answer I've received. So what I'm hearing from you is even if the representation might be there, there might not be a lot of connection, and you may not be drawing out the benefit of people working together or interacting with each other from that perspective. So it may defeat the whole purpose that you may, again, if you have this objective, you may not be achieving it just because you feel like you've achieved the numbers.
Yeah. It's the same thing. I'll do a much less controversial example. A lot of the companies that I've worked with as a consultant, they'll talk about sending people abroad so that they can build cultural agility. Great. But in reality, if you send people to another country, it doesn't mean they're going to build cultural agility. If they spend the entire time in an expat enclave, speaking and befriending and only spending time with their compatriots, they can return 2 or 3 years later, no different than when they left.
Hmm.
It's the exact same thing in a multicultural organization. You just because you put people together doesn't mean they're able to grow from being together. And what I'm hoping and the difference that I think we can make through this cultural agility work is that we can help people be comfortable together. And that's when the great things happen.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. The other thing you mentioned earlier was psychological safety. And that's something I've also debated with other people. And there's this whole notion of, okay, what is psychological safety? And do we need to even label such a term? Because to me, then it's implying that your workplace isn't psychologically safe. R- And do you need to feel psychologically safe in the workplace? Uh, uh, because what I see the direction the conversation takes is, well, be yourself, show up as as yourself. But maybe I don't feel comfortable because for me personally, I have very close friends that I'm myself with as much as possible. But then in the workplace, I don't necessarily feel like I need to. So
Mhm.
there's that whole debate around why is psychological safety even important in the workplace? So a couple of questions then. One, why psychologically safe? And is it implying that the workplace isn't? And then do we need to have that?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's funny. Dana Bourne and I just wrote an article on psychological bravery. And we're actually saying that's something that's even more important, the
Mhm.
ability to speak truth to power, be unpopular, do things that are a bit counterculture. So that's actually another issue, a counter to psychological safety. But what you're talking about is really one of the authenticity sense. And where do I want to show my full authenticity? And frankly, this is getting into the the book that we just wrote, Andy Palmer and I just wrote, called Live for a Living.
Mhm.
How much of who you are do you want to bring to the workplace for whatever way you generate revenue? Like however you're generating income, do you feel like you need to? Do you feel comfortable just going, doing what you're doing, kind of playing by whatever rules the organization sets out, conforming to those, and then the minute you leave your organization, you feel comfortable just being a more real version of yourself because frankly those are the only people who deserve to see the real you, if you will.
Yeah.
Whereas other people are like, no, I don't want to work in any place that I can't be 100% me all throughout the day all the time, and that's cool too.
Mhm.
So what we're advising in the book is you have to have the self-awareness of where you are on that continuum because a lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea of needing to or being encouraged to bring more of themselves than they really want to. Frankly, they have a sense of privacy and a wall between their home, personal, family self and the person they are at work. So
Right.
I think that's more self awareness, and everybody's somewhere on that continuum, and you let people be them.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate that. I think that an individual can make that choice, but I see one of my fears is if the organization is really pushing it hard. Be your authentic self, and that could also feel like almost like for an individual who doesn't want that, a form of alienation, perhaps. I'm not sure, but I just like to again, I don't spent time thinking about these things because I do find them very intriguing and interesting. And again, like I said, when you when an organization says, "Oh, we want to be psychologically safe," to me, that's implying then perhaps they aren't.
I think it's the idea that you want to make sure everyone feels heard, feels respected, has a voice, has agency. And I think those are fair values to have.
Yes.
When it crosses into everybody has to show up as their full authentic self, that's cool too. If you that's the value.
Yeah.
You just don't want to have to push people to sharing more of their personal lives than they're
Right.
necessarily comfortable with. Everyone there's just variance on that. And we need to respect that too.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. No, thank you for exploring that with me. The the other thing I'm interested in is what is Skillify doing then in terms of this space? And I'm sure you've already touched on a lot of the things based on the conversation we've had thus far. But if you don't mind expanding a little bit in terms of the work you guys are doing through Skillify.
Yeah, yeah. So I need to offer a little shout out to Andy Palmer. So he was the angel investor for Skillify. And he basically said, soft skills are so critical. We need to make them available to everyone. They can't just be if you go to an elite institution, higher education, or you happen to have great mentors, can't be just those individuals who have access to building these skills. So the idea behind Skillify, Public Benefit Corporation, is that we made some online assessment tools and development tools free for anyone who wants them. So the first two that we led with was a tool called My Guide, and it's spelled in a funny way. It's MYGIIDE, myguide.com. That's for building cultural agility. The idea that, again, we can have really anyone can build this, anyone can be great at this. And then the other one is called My Journey, MYJOURNII, two I's instead of a Y again. And the idea behind that one was really that the idea of owning your own career and kind of staying in control of your career, making the best career decisions for you, gaining some self awareness about how you like to work, what's the best situation for you when it comes to work, and then directing your career in whatever way you want that will align best with your career goals. And those two things were really important places to start. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing right now. We have tens of thousands of people on the site, which is great. They're both, again, they're free, they're publicly available. We're
Yeah.
really proud of.
No, that's amazing. And I could definitely see a lot of value because most people don't know which direction to take their career in. And that could be tough at times. Or you may be in a role, for example, where you don't feel like you're getting the best out of yourself or it doesn't feel fulfilling. So I can definitely see a lot of value in having some of these tools that can close that gap. But one of the things I've also talked about, and there's still a bit of a gap, and maybe the workplace isn't the right place for it, but addressing people's mental health. And if that's coming to the surface, and it could come up in different ways. And again, maybe there's an overlap with the whole aspect of psychological safety, or in some cases, mental health can be very private for individuals. But how do you address it if there is a situation in the workplace that's contributing to it? Or maybe you need a break from the workplace to go manage it and take some time off. How do you bridge that gap? Because I still see a significant gap there where individuals might not even be comfortable talking about it or even telling their boss, for example, that, hey, I'm struggling with mental health. Maybe I'm dealing with something right now and I just need support. Because the other downside I can see to it, and often you see this, again, it's well intentioned. But if I were to tell someone, hey, maybe I'm dealing with depression right now, they might start getting worried for me and checking it. And that's probably not what I want. I was just telling them just so they were aware. So I could also see that being a bit of a concern for an individual to share something like that in the workplace as well.
Wow, there's no quick answer for a really important question for kind of you just asked. So at the again at the high level, a lot of companies are offering employee assistance
Yeah.
programs to give a private and confidential outlet for people who are struggling. That to me, it has been a tried and true practice for decades. And I think that still remains a really beautiful way for companies, at least to say we acknowledge that you have, that anyone at any time could be struggling and that we want to be there for you without you having to feel like you have to disclose anything specifically to a boss or to or whatever. So that's at the structural level, like
Right.
offer those. If a company's not offering, do it because it's the right thing to do. Now, the comfort with disclosure and then making sure it's landing in the ear of the supervisor who knows what to do and say, that becomes a really kind of individual dynamic. So some people aren't comfortable disclosing, and then they will privately go on a medical leave, maybe through a doctor's referral. Some people are very comfortable kind of disclosing, but it might land in a supervisor's ear that they don't know what to do with it. And then they start treating the person differently. Or it might respond, or it might be a supervisor who absolutely knows how to respond. And
Mhm.
they're comfortable saying, are there resources we could offer? Is there something we could do to support? Here are some resources I know about. Would you like me to follow up with you?
Yeah.
So that's a really well-trained supervisor.
Yeah.
You can imagine all the kind of combinations of the person who's going through the mental health and a wellness challenge, and then the supervisor and their ability to address it. So
Yes.
I just hope that companies are doing the training needed and setting the culture so that as much disclosure as individuals want to offer,
Yeah.
the supervisors are in fact they know what to do with it.
Yeah, and I was actually speaking at it was more of an online thing where we were talking about mental health in the workplace. And one of the things people kept asking was, What should leaders do?" And for me, what came up at that time, and I'll share here now too, is maybe that's asking too much of a leader to be able to support, right? And I gave the example of myself becoming a therapist. There's so much training involved, and you have to do a significant and lengthy practicum to even demonstrate that you've acquired the skills that you can deal with when certain situations arise. So to ask a leader to respond to something like that, maybe it's asking for too much. And I agree, perhaps there's some training involved around how to deal with it at a very high level, but to expect the leader to have the right answer, that to me is, in my mind, a bit too much at times, given the nature of the situation too, right?
I think I think we are asking, we can't ask every supervisor to both be the head of engineering and also, by the way, have an advanced degree in psychology and in clinical counseling. That's a little unfair. And you can't run to a training class and get the certificate and all of a sudden do everything perfectly. And even counselors can't do it perfectly. So I think you're right. There's a lot to ask. I think there's some steps that people can take that would be a little bit of a cheat sheet on, okay, if somebody comes to you and here's what they're saying, at least go through these sort of c- questions or offer these resources. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
And on the other side, I think companies can do, in addition to offering the employee assistance programs, they can do some training on problem focused coping, symptom focused coping, when
Yes.
to use which, how to use which, what's negative problem focused, what's negative symptom focused, what's positive problem. Those are the things that we in psychology, of course, we know well that I'm always surprised that a lot of people don't think about. We hear so much about self-care these days. And I keep thinking, well, wow, we've overloaded the symptom focused coping without giving people the skills for problem focused coping. I think there's room there as well.
Yeah, and there is something I do wanna branch off of that you shared, and I did wanna talk about that too, is it is self-care, and I don't know if companies are doing enough to teach even employees these skills, right? Especially if an employee's feeling like they're being overworked, they're perhaps on the verge of having a burnout type of situation. Are we equipping individuals with self-care techniques? And again, when I'm working with clients, it's okay, maybe try this out, maybe do some meditation, maybe do some relaxation, whatever it is. We're not talking about that as well. And again, is the workplace the right place? Perhaps, because there could be a lot of stressors. And as we've touched on, there could be some mental health related challenges for individuals, but that self care piece can sometimes be missing. And there could be some training around it and more conversation around it as well.
That's that was a really great example. I just think that's such a beautiful example, Lays. So an individual is feeling overworked.
Yeah.
Think about stress. It's demands versus resources. Either there's not enough time to do what's being, or there's not enough whatever, any kind of resources for whatever is being asked of them. Whatever it is, the equation is off balance. The symptom focus would be the things we can train on meditation and deep breathing and all that other great positive symptom focused coping. But in that case, also training on problem focused coping might be useful. So instead of complaining to friends or being cynical about the company, this might be a conversation with a supervisor about priorities or keeping a great log of what work is getting done when, with what interruptions and what meetings and what time is remaining relative to the workload that's needed, and having that very clear matter of fact conversation with a supervisor about their priorities. That's fair. But that's problem focused coping, right? And different from symptom focused coping. So I think to your point, we should be training on all of this great self care, symptom focused coping. But I think we should also be training on some of the problem focused coping as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of training.
We're all for it.
No, I appreciate that. Uh, No, and again, I really value your time and everything you've shared with us today, including your own insights and wisdom. Is there anything else that you feel like we haven't touched on that is of value in this space and could be a benefit for the listeners to even learn about or hear about?
Yeah. So I know we originally chatted about the new book, Live for a Living. And I just want to underscore to your listeners how valuable it is to stay in control of your career journey, that
Mhm.
it is so critical today, in particular, nowadays, when people are shifting jobs, but it's often because they get the call from the headhunter or because they see an opportunity on LinkedIn. It's not as much of they're not moving toward something or toward an ideal career. Rather, they're either getting swayed into a role or they're just so fed up with where they are that they're moving. Or they take a promotion because they're finally being asked, right? None of these are intentional steps. They're letting other people manage their
Yeah.
careers. So that was a long way of saying that the big premise around Live for a Living was giving people the skills in order to manage and self manage their career journey so that they can have the greatest level of fulfillment. I hope, I hope folks will check it out. But if not, again, there's those free resources available that happy to have people enjoy.
Yeah, no, I think that's so crucial. And I could even relate my own personal experience with that. And it was very different. But I have an engineering background, and most of the listeners probably know that. But it was definitely a decision I had made when I was pressured by my family. It was like, okay, you got to pick something, and engineering's very career path. And I enjoyed it, but then at some point I started realizing that it wasn't fulfilling me. It's not where I'm feeling my best. And now that I've gone into this therapy world and almost working for myself, I've started to get that sense of fulfillment. So it took me a few wrong turns or different turns to get to this journey, or at least this part of my journey. And I think having something like what you've shared in terms of mapping it out can be very helpful. And I didn't have that, or nor did I do it at the time. But that's just my experience. So I did want to share that importance because I came to learn it in a different way.
Yeah, that's the experience of many people, right? Where we fall into careers and then we are other people are guiding it as opposed
Yeah.
to us being in control.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with it either. I think it's just whatever works for you, right? It
Right.
for me, it served
Absolutely.
me at the
Absolutely.
time. Yeah. Thank you again, Paula. And for listeners, I also give the guests this opportunity, but if listeners wanted to find you online or some ways they wanted to find your work, what are some ways they can do that?
Sure. I'm on Instagram on Dr. Paula Caligiuri. I'm on LinkedIn, Paula Caligiuri, and you can also connect through the Skillify website. So our company is Skilify. So two I's, one L, Skillify.com.
Is there a theme behind the two eyes?
You know what? Because it began with we're helping people see eye to eye.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how it began. So we just kept going with the eyes.
Thank you again.
Oh, my pleasure, Furkhan. Thank you.